Hello everyone. As you are listening to me right now, I am sure that you all have a device on hand that can tell you what time it is. A clock, a phone, a computer, a wristwatch. Timekeeping and the organization of our days based on time are central to our lives. On most days we need to precisely know what time it is, or how much time we have left before we switch to another activity. And this is not just in a work environment. It also matters for socialization with friends or family, and meetings, and even on holidays or days off. This imperative of timekeeping may be relaxed, but it is still there. The prevalence of time in our lives was not always as strong. It is actually a modern phenomenon that has gained importance over the past 2 or 3 centuries. Timekeeping tends to appear spontaneously in human societies, because keeping track of the moments in a day, anticipating on day and night time, or knowing the cycles of seasons and years is something necessary to survival and social life. This is at the center of our story for tonight. I will tell you about the different devices and methods mankind has come up with to measure time, from the most basic observation of the sky, or the first shadow clocks and water clocks, all the way to the quartz timer in your phone and atomic clocks. We will see how they worked, how relevant each of these techniques became to the cultures that used them, and I will also tell you a little bit about the cultural importance of time and timekeeping, which is something that evolved a lot across time and human societies. So make yourself comfortable. Don't forget that you can also listen to my stories on other platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and others. Apple Music was a bit complicated for a few weeks because most of my stories had disappeared from it. But this was fixed, so you can return there if this is convenient for you. I also invite you to join my Patreon page. You can contribute whatever you want, and it gives you access to all the stories as podcasts, with and without background sounds. And you can also download audios and videos, get updates and previews, or participate in surveys. Our topic tonight, for example, was chosen by patrons. And now, let's begin. What do we talk about exactly when we speak of timekeeping devices? Obviously, of systems, of appliances that give us the current time. But not only. It is also about measuring how much time has passed between 2 events, measuring years and their possible divisions in months or weeks, establishing calendars, and associating dates with past or future events, which helps us locate them on the time axis to make these dates make sense given our representation of time. So, how did the first human societies deal with this? simply by looking at astronomical bodies at first, the sun, the moon, stars, which gave them a rough estimate of time. This helped build a structure, a frame, with days and years, as they observed cycles that kept repeating. Some of the oldest traces of architecture in stone we know of, like Stonehenge, are thought to have been astronomical observatories. One of their functions was to follow seasonal and annual events, like solstices or equinoxes. The solstice is when the sun reaches its maximum or minimum declination. Concretely, it gives the longest and shortest days of the year. And in the northern hemisphere, this happens around June the 21st and December the 21st. These dates are used to officially mark the beginning of new seasons, summer and winter respectively. The equinox is the time when the sun crosses the celestial equator. Days and nights are approximately the same length when this happens, which is also twice a year, around March the 21st and September the 21st. Equinoxes traditionally mark the beginning of spring and fall. I'm telling you these things to illustrate that the first elements, the first recurring events that gave a frame to timekeeping were these natural phenomena: the cycle of a day, the cycle of the moon, the yearly cycle, the seasons. Based on these observations, calendars appeared spontaneously around the world, in written form or not, everywhere. But we don't know much more than that about the timekeeping methods in prehistoric times, because they left no other traces. An evolution that seems to have appeared in the second millennium BC, more than 3,000 years ago, was the making of devices that kept track of time on shorter periods of time, within a day, using something that moved continuously. Shadow clocks or sundials, for example, that used the position of the sun in the sky to determine time. Water clocks that used the constant flow of water falling. Candle clocks with a candle burning. If you think about a mechanical watch or a clock, the mechanism inside is not in constant motion. It moves at a steady rate. For example, every second a gear moves, and in between these moves, the mechanism stays motionless. The invention of such mechanisms for timekeeping that use oscillation happened much later, in the 13th century, and they revolutionized clockmaking. But before that, the only methods to keep track of time were based on continuous processes, something falling, something burning, or an astronomical body moving in the sky. It doesn't mean ancient methods were that basic. They were refined and improved over the centuries, and spectacular machines based on these continuous processes were built, from China or India to the Middle East and Europe. So let's take a look at these ancient devices. The very first systems of timekeeping within a day that we know of are shadow clocks that later developed into sundials. what is the difference between the two? A shadow clock measures time based on the length of a shadow, which will depend on the position and the motion of the sun during the day. A vertical stick planted in the ground can be a shadow clock. At the beginning of a day, it will have a long shadow projected opposite to the sun. The shadow will shorten as the sun rises to reach its minimum length at midday, and then the shadow will grow longer again, but on the other side of the stick, as the day keeps advancing. A sundial is an evolution of the shadow clock. It uses the same principle of reading time with the shadow of a vertical stick or pole, but the shadow is projected onto a surface with a reference scale, like the needle of a watch, except the needle is a shadow. All major cultures around the world, on all continents, invented sundials. The oldest ever discovered was found in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, the burial place of pharaohs during the Egyptian New Kingdom, and it was dated to 1500 BC. It is well possible that the Egyptians used sundials long before that. We also know that the ancient Babylonians made some, thanks to references to them on clay tablets. And in the first millennium BC, sundials became frequent around the Mediterranean. The Greeks made many, and the Romans adopted them. The first sundial in Rome would have arrived during the 3rd century BC, looted from a Greek colony in Sicily. One thing the Greeks and the Romans realized was that if a sundial was moved, transported to another location, it lost its accuracy, which is logical depending on where you are on Earth, at which latitude, the position of the sun is going to change. So the Greeks, as they used to do, refined the system and used deduction to better understand what was happening. In the 2nd century, they discovered it was possible to calculate in advance where the sun would be in the sky at a given time and at a given geographical latitude. It was also in ancient times, in the Near East and the Greek world, that the concept of hour was established. We are used to count time in hours, and we know there are 24 hours in a day, each of them comprising 60 minutes or 3,600 seconds. But this is a convention. Hours are not derived from an observable phenomenon, and one day could have been divided into 40 or 20 or 10 shorter units of time instead of 24. So why do we have 24 hours in a day? The Greeks started dividing daytime into 12 equal portions, and they called these portions of time orae or orai. The word hour comes from this. But these hours were seasonal. It means they started at dawn and ended at sunset, which implies that in the winter, when days were shorter, 1 hour was shorter than a summer hour. At the time of classical Greece, only the day was divided into 12 hours. The night was divided into 3 or 4 night watches that also varied in duration depending on the seasons. In the 2nd century BC, the practice of also dividing the night into hours began to spread, and it became the norm. This antique norm of hours that change duration depending on the season, with longer hours in the summer and shorter hours in the winter, lasted for centuries until the late Middle Ages, when mechanical clocks began to be used. With hours that constantly changed in duration during the year, clocks had to be readjusted every morning and evening, which was very inconvenient. And because of this, because time needed to be standardized differently, people progressively got used to a system of fixed hours, 1 hour being redefined as 1/24th of a day, whatever the season or duration of day and night time. Returning to antiquity, the problem with sundials was that obviously they only worked during the day and when the sky was not too cloudy. For the night, the Egyptians came up with another instrument called a merket, which looked basically like a plumb line. The Egyptians divided the night sky into decans. I told you about that recently in the history of astrology and astronomy. They would align the plumb line with Polaris, the North Pole star, and by looking at where the other stars were located on either side, they could roughly determine what time it was and how much time remained before dawn. So sundials were useful and also a source of discoveries about celestial bodies and geography. But other methods appeared too. One that is probably almost as old is the water clock, also called a clepsydra. In its most basic form, a clepsydra is a vessel, a container, in which a regulated flow of water falls, or from which a flow of water escapes. The level of liquid in it indicates how much time has passed. Here again, the oldest known water clock was found in Egypt and dated from the 14th century BC. But there is older documentation, an inscription in a tomb from 200 years earlier that speaks of a water clock and indicates that the tomb's owner, its occupant, a court official called Amenemhet, would have been its inventor. If true, which is unsure because the ancient Egyptians could brag a little on the walls of their tombs, water clocks would have appeared there by the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. In any case, at the same period, there were probably already water clocks in Mesopotamia. None was found, but inscriptions on clay tablets from the 2nd millennium BC refer to them. They were used by day and night guards of cities in Mesopotamia. When the guards began their watch, they poured a certain quantity of water in a large container shaped like a cylinder with a hole near the bottom, and their work hours ended when the cylinder was empty, a practical use of a water clock to measure a fixed quantity of time. The Babylonians used temporal hours, not fixed hours, because as I told you before, in antiquity the duration of hours changed with the seasons, since hours were defined as portions of daytime. So the tablets indicate the exact quantity of water to pour into the clock, depending on the period of the year. The guards were paid to watch a certain portion of day or night time, not a fixed quantity of time. There can be two types of water clocks: inflow or outflow. An outflow water clock means that a container is filled with water and the water is drained slowly and evenly out of the container. There are markings inside, and the level of water indicates how much time has elapsed. Now, this is the basic principle, the basic form, but it could be improved. The Greeks, the Romans, or the Chinese did it. Water has weight, so the accumulation of weight in a container as time passes can be used to trigger mechanisms with gearing and an escapement mechanism. That is to say, a mechanical linkage that periodically releases a gear train, triggers a mechanism. Imagine the container that gets filled with water is placed on a scale. As it becomes heavier with the passing of time, a moment will come when it will tip the scale, when it is heavy enough. This is a movement that can be transported with gears and chains to moving pieces on a dial or to an automaton. The Chinese in particular proved very ingenious at this. They elaborated complex systems based on water clocks. One of the most impressive was a clock tower designed by Su Song, a scholar from the 11th century. He combined a water wheel system with chain drives, gears, escapement mechanism to power a sphere representing celestial bodies moving, following real celestial bodies in the sky in real time, and more than 100 striking clock jacks that could sound the hours and display informative plaques. This tower was a marvel of engineering, only powered by water falling evenly from one container to the next. This astronomical clock tower was over 30 feet tall, and it was the pinnacle of a millennium of improvements and inventions, all along the first millennium AD. Another Chinese innovation was the replacement of water with mercury for the fanciest clocks. Water works very well, but the problem is that it freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, and this is not such an extraordinary temperature. Mercury is liquid at room temperature and freezes only at minus 38 degrees, way lower than any air temperature normally found on Earth. So that was useful for big machines that were typically placed outside buildings and could be exposed to really cold temperatures. The original astronomical tower built by Su Song was lost, and so were all the machines from the first millennium. We only have the plans. But modern replicas exist, and they reveal the ingenuity and engineering capabilities of their creators. Other systems using containers slowly filling with water were imagined. For example, in India. In the 5th century, at Nalanda, in the east of India, there was a Buddhist university where the passing of time was tracked with a bowl holding 2 floats placed in a larger bowl. The first bowl had a small hole at the bottom that let water slowly in, and after exactly 4 hours, this bowl would sink when it contained enough water. Someone would beat a drum to indicate that 4 hours had passed, and the system would be rearmed for a new cycle. A similar system, with a bowl sinking in a larger container, was widespread in Persia before Islamic times, in antiquity. In different regions of Persia that were arid, the right to access water from springs and rivers was shared between different farmers or estate owners. Each one could divert water from a spring to his land for a given portion of the day. And in order to manage these water rights, people were hired to supervise a water clock and ensure that each shareholder of the resource got what they were entitled to. One of many examples that show the importance of timekeeping in society. It served for a lot of activities, economic here, but also religious, to signal the times of prayers or ceremonies during the day, military, to coordinate actions, for navigation too. I will elaborate on this later. No complex human society can function without norms about timekeeping and methods or devices to keep track of time. The last developments of water clocks, that also gave birth to spectacular machines, like in China, happened in the medieval Islamic world. Various Arab and Persian scholars, engineers, built upon the gear mechanisms that had been introduced in ancient Greece and Rome to create ever more complex machines. They also used new mechanical parts in water clocks, like epicyclic gearing, which was introduced around the year 1000. Epicyclic gearing consists of systems with several toothed wheels within a circle gear, and they are all connected. They transmit their motion to each other, but they allow for plenty of different ratios or motions. The gears can also move inside the circle gear, which permits plenty of different transmissions of signals and movement. In the 11th century, water clocks using these complex gears were built in Spain, in Morocco or Syria, and these works culminated in 1206 with the so-called castle clock, created by Al-Jazari, a scholar and inventor. It was a big device, the size of a small house, 11 feet high, that had multiple functions alongside timekeeping. On top, it displayed the zodiac on a wheel, with the orbits of the sun and the moon, following their path in real time. Under this zodiac, there was a little gallery, a gateway, where a pointer traveled on a hidden card, marking the hours, and as it traveled, it opened little doors every hour, each revealing a mannequin. Near the base there were 5 automatons, 5 little musicians who automatically played music, and on each side an automaton resembling a falcon that could drop little balls into vases under them. All of this connected and powered by water regularly flowing from a tank and transmitting energy to water wheels and gears. Together with the Antikythera mechanism, that I also told you about recently, and that was 13 centuries older. This castle clock is considered to be an ancient form of programmable analog computer. You put it in place, filled the tank with water, and it automatically calculated the positions of celestial bodies or kept track of time. At the time it was invented, hours were not fixed units of time yet. That was before mechanical clocks and the definition of hours as 1/24th of a day, regardless of daytime and nighttime, as I told you before. So daytime hours during the summer lasted more minutes than daytime hours during the winter, and the machine took that into account. It could be reprogrammed for the changing length of day and night throughout the year. Another type of devices refined during the Islamic Middle Ages was the astrolabe, which is not just a timekeeping device, but rather a broader astronomical instrument. Astrolabes date back from classical antiquity, the first millennium BC, and they were used as navigation instruments too. The astrolabe serves as a star and planets chart, and in its simplest form it looks like a metal disc with a pattern of wires, cutouts and perforations that allow the user to calculate astronomical positions precisely. So when you know how to use it, it can help you find a particular star or planet, or to determine local latitude if you know local time, and vice versa, determine the time if you know the latitude. In the Islamic world, especially in Persia, clocks and astrolabes were sometimes merged into a single device. These were never common objects, they were high-technology marvels of their time, and only a few units were made for universities or kings. But they show that the use of gears, escapement mechanisms and complex systems was intensifying by the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in timekeeping devices. They were still powered by a continuous process, water falling in that case, but the era of mechanical clocks was approaching. Before we talk about it, there were a few other ancient methods that deserve to be mentioned. They include incense and candle clocks, both based on another continuous process, the controlled burning of something. Incense in sticks burns without a flame and evenly. For short periods of time, straight sticks could be used, but for longer periods, incense was shaped in spiral on a disc with reference marks that indicated how much time had passed since it had been lighted. Sometimes the spiral could be made of different incenses with different scents that would indicate with their scent the current time. This type of incense clock that could be easily transported and turned into a home object became popular in ancient China as a kind of high-end gift. Candle clocks that were graduated and slowly burned were another method based on the same principle. Candles burned evenly, and provided their diameter and material was replicated, they could be manufactured in large quantities. These were used in China in the first millennium and in medieval Europe, especially in churches and monasteries, to keep track of time and ring the bells at the times of religious services along the day. And there was also the hourglass, which is not as old as one could imagine. It seems the hourglass appeared in the Middle Ages in Western Europe, not before the 11th or 12th centuries at the earliest. The making of a hourglass implied the use of glass blowing, which at the time was a form of craft only practiced in Europe. So there is no known trace of hourglasses everywhere else before the first European medieval ones. It appeared late, but it was a quick success. An hourglass could be used in a wide range of applications, at sea, in churches, in industry, or in cooking. It was reusable, not too difficult to calibrate, because hourglasses are used for relatively short periods of time. It was not too expensive to make. Glass was a bit expensive at the time, but considering it was reusable, it was still affordable. So it spread to public buildings, to homes, ships, and it became well known. So much that from the 15th century onward, it took on symbolic meanings in the West. It became a symbol of time itself, or death, or just to indicate that waiting is required. Hourglasses stayed in use long after the introduction of watches and other types of mechanical clocks, for their simplicity. The biggest revolution to date in the history of timekeeping began with the introduction of mechanical clocks by the end of the 13th century. This was a revolution first because of their increased complexity, but also conceptually. Mechanical clocks use oscillating devices instead of being based on a continuous process, be it the motion of the sun, water or sand. A breakthrough was the invention of an escapement mechanism called the Virgin Foliot, around 1275. So what is this? A Virgin Foliot consists of a vertical shaft topped with a crown wheel. This is the verge that rotated and drove a foliot, a horizontal bar with weights attached on either side near its ends. When the verge rotated, it tried to communicate its rotation to the foliot via the gear wheel, and this made the foliot oscillate back and forth, which produced a regular tick, an oscillation. The system could be adjusted for longer or shorter intervals between the ticks if the weights were placed farther from the axis near the ends of the foliot. The oscillation would be slower and faster when the weights were placed closer to the verge. In other words, the Virgin Foliot was a system that transformed a continuous rotation into an oscillation. The advantage and really new thing with that system based on oscillation is the production of a signal, a tick that comes back regularly and can put in motion gears. This is what is called a regulator in horology, a device that maintains a designated value. Typically in a clock, the tick is calibrated to last 1 second, and from there the system of gears with different ratios will be able to track minutes, hours, days, or even years in more complex clocks. There was already a know-how of gears, transmission systems using chains between gears, more complex systems of gears like the epicyclic gearing that I told you about before. And now, with the ability to mechanically produce an oscillation, all the ingredients to make mechanical clocks were present. They were first introduced into large tower clocks that had progressively appeared in European cities of the Middle Ages, and were initially water clocks, with big dials giving time to everyone. These clocks were convenient, and they were also an element of prestige for the medieval cities that could afford them, or the people who had the means to offer them to their cities. Along the 14th century, these big clock towers were increasingly equipped with mechanical systems based on oscillation, and here again, with a lot of creativity from engineers to make them attractive. The fanciest ones had doors opening every hour, and a little show of automatons taking place when the bell rang. In practice, the first clocks based on the verge and foliot escapement were very imprecise. Typically, they would drift by as much as 2 hours every day, so they had to be readjusted once or twice a day using a sundial. It was far from ideal. But these clocks became all the rage by the late 14th century, first in Italian cities, and slightly later in France and England. Between 1371 and 1380, over just 10 years, more than 70 European cities built a public clock. This tells us of the importance of timekeeping in these urban areas of the time. Giving the time was a valuable and necessary public service because everyone needed it. The students, the rich, the poor, men, women, everyone had a life that was timed with working hours, meetings, time periods during the day dedicated to certain tasks. Very slowly, and in a way that was barely perceptible, people's relationship to time was beginning to change. Lives were less and less connected to just daytime and nighttime, the rhythms determined by nature, like they had been for all of mankind's history. This was also the period when seasonal hours, with a duration that fluctuated with the seasons, were replaced with fixed hours that all lasted the same and ignored daytime and nighttime. The following 300 years saw major developments that improved the accuracy of mechanical clocks, which, as I said, was very poor at first. Clocks were also big objects, at least several feet high, because the only ways to power them, for example with a counterweight slowly descending, were rather cumbersome. This changed in the 15th century, with the invention of the mainspring. Like a weight that is placed high and will slowly descend, the torsion of a spring is a way of storing energy inside a device, an energy that is then slowly and steadily liberated. Not that steadily at first, actually, and that was the main problem of clocks that limited their accuracy. So new devices were invented to even out the force released, such as the stack-freed or the fusee, which are mechanisms that help to equalize the uneven force released by a mainspring or a descending weight. The improvement in accuracy allowed the use of clocks for other things than just indicate the time. For example, in navigation in the 16th century. If you keep a clock set to the local time of a starting point of your journey, whose longitude is known, you could determine the longitude of any other point you had reached by comparing this original time on the clock with the local time of the place where you had arrived. This helps navigators to estimate more and more precisely where they were at sea and follow the desired route. So clocks improved, the first pocket watches appeared thanks to mainsprings, but they still needed to be readjusted regularly because of their drift, which could easily be several minutes in a day, despite the improvement to their accuracy since the first medieval prototypes. The era of precision timekeeping really started in the 17th century, with another major innovation: the use of oscillators that were subject to harmonic motion. What is this phenomenon, harmonic motion? If you imagine a pendulum in a clock, it moves back and forth, or left to right, and always comes back to its central position after the same amount of time. And this is so because its maximum displacement on one side is equal to its maximum displacement on the other side. So it oscillates and produces time intervals between each cycle of oscillation that are always the same. It also works with a mass attached to a spring that goes up and down. The mass falls because of gravity, then it is pulled up by the force from the spring, and this type of system will tend to find an equilibrium, a harmonic motion, in which the two forces are equivalent and keep the mass going up and down. This could last forever if it happened in a void, but in practice it doesn't, because the mass, or the pendulum, are attached to something and also subject to friction from the air. But still, this type of oscillators is much more accurate and lasts much longer without intervention than the first mechanical oscillators like the Virgin Foliot. The era of precision timekeeping began with the introduction of this type of oscillators in horology. The first pendulum clock was created in 1656 by a Dutch inventor, Christian Huygens, and this helps dramatically improve accuracy. His first prototype erred by only 1 minute per day, and later ones by only 10 seconds per day, which was something that had never been achieved before. From this point on, and all along the 18th and 19th centuries, an intense competition between horologers began to produce ever more precise and reliable clocks, which led to plenty of other inventions and techniques with gears that minimized friction or alloys of materials that were less subject to temperature. When you start making very precise devices, the dilatation of the instruments and mechanisms due to variations in temperature becomes a problem that can affect accuracy. This was not a major concern before, when clocks erred by several minutes every day anyway. But when clockmakers started aiming at perfection, it became a problem. Many things were tried to solve this dilatation problem. For example, by the late 18th century, mercury started to be put inside pendulums to mitigate the effect of temperature variations. And in the late 19th century, a new alloy called invar, which is made from iron and nickel, started to be used because it expands very little with heat. A good illustration of the race to ever better timekeeping was the development of the marine chronometer. In 1707, the British Royal Navy suffered a disaster off the coast of Sicily in the Mediterranean due to navigation mistakes. 4 ships had wrecked and been entirely lost, causing the deaths of hundreds of sailors, just because they were unable to correctly calculate their position with the clocks, the charts, compasses and other instruments at their disposal. I told you earlier that ships used clocks since the 16th century to determine the longitude they were at any given moment. This worked, but was still rather imprecise, for a part because clocks erred, and this was amplified on ships due to the ships moving at sea, when clocks needed to remain perfectly horizontal to work as intended. If a clock has a pendulum and you shake it, it is going to interfere with its oscillations. So the British government offered a prize to anyone who would create an instrument accurate enough to determine longitude to within only a few miles. This competition was entered by a clockmaker from Yorkshire, who designed a few years later the first sea clock, which was able to remain horizontal and stopped working if the ships moved suddenly. He used the name chronometer for it, which has remained for particularly accurate timepieces. And this need for better devices, for a practical use like navigation, contributed to the ongoing improvement of clocks. In the 19th century, electricity was introduced as a power source, and with it would follow a few decades later, in the 20th century, the discovery of a new possible oscillator, quartz crystals. As you can imagine, there is no pendulum or spring or gears in your phone, and yet it is able to give you time. So how does it work? In modern timepieces, time is tracked not mechanically, but electrically or electronically, using the properties of quartz crystals, which can help build devices more precise than any mechanical clock could ever be. How is it possible? Quartz crystals have a particular property. They are called piezoelectric, which means that when they are subject to mechanical stress, such as bending, they accumulate electric charges, and it works in reverse. When electric charges are applied to them, they tend to bend. Another advantage of quartz is that its size does not change much as temperature fluctuates. Modern horology uses these properties. Applying electricity to a quartz crystal turns it into an oscillator that produces a very steady signal with precise frequency. The principles of this technology were discovered in the first half of the 20th century, and in the 1960s, the first consumer products using quartz technology began to be sold. In the 1980s, with the development of electronics, quartz timekeepers became very inexpensive to produce, and more precise than mechanical clocks and watches by an order of magnitude. So they quickly replaced mechanical clocks. They were added to computers and all appliances that keep time. A crystal quartz is what you have in your phone, your laptop, your desktop computer, your kitchen appliances if they give time, your car. They are everywhere now. And their success has been such that mechanical clockmaking has turned into a niche luxury industry at this point. Having access to time at any moment is now considered ordinary. We need it. Our relationship to time has evolved dramatically over the centuries, and maybe faster than ever over the past 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution and the introduction of precisely timed work hours. A major change in industrialized countries has been a new perception of time by the vast majority of the population. Time has become a resource, and a precious one. A resource that has to be put to use, not just for work. There is time for leisure, friends, family, for rest, for oneself. There is lost time and quality time. We take our time or we don't. All of these terms, even when they speak of time as something that has to be enjoyed or used to relax, they reflect an utilitarian understanding of time. We have to do something with it. We have some in a limited quantity before the end of the day or the end of our lives. For psychology, anthropology, sociology, this is an interesting field of research. It tells about how we live and look at our lives. We should not assume that the perception of time was always as it is today. In pre-industrial societies, the urge to accomplish something with every bit of time available was probably not as strong. There is a field of research called chronemics that studies how time is perceived and communicated across cultures with the tools of anthropology, philosophy, or linguistics. And looking at the status, the importance of time and its management can also reveal cultural differences that persist. Just to give an example, a cultural difference in the management and perception of time is what is called monochronic and polychronic time. A monochronic perception of time is the tendency to do things one at a time and segment time into small, precise units. What I referred to before when I told you we have time for different things. There is work time, which itself is segmented into smaller units for different tasks. We have personal time, resting time, socialization time, and these tend to be kept separated. We don't try to do several things at the same time. In societies that see themselves as monochronic, and this is typically the case of the United States or Northern and Western Europe, this way of segmenting time is taught to us and valued as a way to be more efficient in whatever we do. Now this is just a cultural trait among many, and it doesn't erase the existence of individual personalities and behaviors. But I guess anyone living in the West can relate to this. For monochronic cultures, time tends to be seen as a resource or a commodity. Hence sayings like wasting one's time, gaining time, time is money. Time would be something that we consume. And with this perception comes the high value placed on schedules, tasks, punctuality, as a way of respecting the time of others. This factor weighs a lot in how we live and engage with other people. Again, it is far from being the only factor to determine our interactions with others. It is not that simple. For example, the United States is probably one of the countries in the world where this monochronic tendency is the strongest across its entire society. And yet, in America, salespersons or waiters in restaurants will typically take a bit of their time to do small talk with customers. This is something that almost never happens in Europe. A sales attendant asking a complete stranger how they're doing and pretending to care about the answer. This would really be awkward, but in America it is commonplace. So, if the United States are monochronic, why do people lose their time doing this? This can happen in a monochronic society because there are other rules. There are rules of civility, of politeness, that are important. And it is not necessarily contradictory. Giving away a little portion of your precious time and attention to someone you don't know yet is a good way to show that you care about establishing a connection. It is a little gift which makes sense to initiate a transaction. In opposition to monochronic time, there is polychronic time, a trait that has been identified as more pronounced in South Asia, Latin America, or Africa. Polychronic time is the absence of strict segmentation. Several things can be done at once, and time is perceived in larger sections that are more fluid. A more polychronic person will typically base their perception of time on environmental phenomena like dawn or sunset. They will refer less to strict times during the day, which means that strict punctuality is not going to be that important to them, not out of a lack of care or respect for the persons they are supposed to meet, but because there is no perception that the others will lose their time. They can always do something else and switch tasks. A polychronic inclination will tend to make people focus more on objectives that are not precisely placed on a schedule, whereas a monochronic person will cut a goal into subtasks and fixed deadlines, schedules, that are going to become intermediary goals. Polychronic individuals also tend to establish shared personal connections with others before a common task is started, whereas a monochronic person will tend to see these work relationships as temporary and practical. No one or no society is fully one or the other. It is a continuum. What I wish to illustrate here is how time perception is eminently cultural. The passing of time is an objective phenomenon, of course, that affects everyone, but the way we perceive and live it can vary a lot. Returning to technical aspects, I told you that quartz timers were the most widespread timekeeping devices today, thanks to their accuracy and affordability. but they are not the most accurate. The ultimate timekeeping device we have is the atomic clock, which was invented in the 20th century. So, what is an atomic clock, concretely? Since the 13th century and the introduction of oscillation rather than a continuous process to keep track of time, more and more accurate timepieces have been made with oscillators. Pendulums are oscillators, quartz crystals too, and in the case of an atomic clock, the oscillator is the resonant frequency of atoms. To keep things simple, atoms can have different energy levels, and when their electrons transition from an energy level to another, they interact with a very specific frequency of electromagnetic radiation. In other words, they produce an extremely reliable and steady oscillation, a tick, that can be used to keep track of time. A mechanical clock with a pendulum knows the time because it counts how many times the pendulum swings back and forth. An atomic clock knows the time because it counts how many times an atom wiggles. Quartz timers improved accuracy by an order of magnitude, and so did atomic clocks, compared with quartz. They are accurate to within a few seconds over many thousands of years. A recent atomic clock from 2014 at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in America measures time with an uncertainty of 1 second in 300 million years. It is almost perfect. The first ever practical atomic clock was built in 1955, and since then many more have been added. There are more than 200 nowadays, functioning around the world. And because they became by far the most accurate devices, standard time around the world is now based on them. Since 1967, the duration of a second in the International System of Units is based on the properties of the atom of cesium, a relatively rare chemical element that is used in atomic clocks. A second, if you ever wondered how it was defined, is officially the time that elapses during a bit more than 9 billion cycles of the radiation produced by the transition between two levels of the cesium atom. The numbers don't really matter here. What it means is that this reference to a radiation cycle allows for extremely precise definition and tracking of time, which is useful not just for breaking records. The information given by atomic clocks is used to perfectly uniformize timekeeping around the world, or for navigation by satellite networks, such as GPS. These systems need very precise timing because they indicate the position of objects on Earth by multiplying the time by the speed of light. This means that a timing error of 1 nanosecond, a billionth of a second, translates into a significant error in the position, an error of about 12 inches or 30 centimeters. So these systems need extreme precision that even quartz devices could not provide. Without atomic clocks, GPS would be far less accurate than it is. It's been a very long road, full of discoveries and scientific and technical leaps forward, since men began to measure time with shadow clocks or water clocks 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. I hope you liked this introduction to timekeeping devices. This is all for tonight. I'll be back soon with a new story. And in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.